We say this with every session, but I think this is going to be a powerful conversation. My name is Lakesha McDay. I am the president of the Moriah Group, and am happy to be the moderator for this session as we talk about Justice Reimagined, community-centered reform. And this is, again, the fifth and final of our five-part series that is based on the newly released report that the Moriah Group put out called Our Dreams Won't Be Deferred, Reclaiming Progress for Black Men and Boys in an Age of Retreat. And this comprehensive seminal report gave us an opportunity to take a 15-year look at what has happened for Black men and boys across this country, based on sort of five key areas: education, health, employment, fatherhood and families, and justice. And so it gave us an opportunity to look back and to look forward and really think about ways that things have improved and opportunities that we still have to close the equity gap, to close the gap for thriving for Black men and boys in this country. So we have an excellent panel today. I'm really excited to introduce, and it's bringing together leaders from across the country, from the East Coast to the Midwest to the West Coast, bringing together those lived experiences, that expertise, and those voices that I think will provide for a wonderful dialogue and conversation on today. So over the course of the discussion, we'll examine some strategies that include, what does it look like to scale community-based interventions, particularly around reducing violence and recidivism, reform in policing, and reform in pretrial justice. One of the things that we intentionally did at the Moriah Group is looking at the word, sort of our, criminal justice or criminal legal system. We wanted to be intentional about calling it the criminal legal system versus the justice system, because we still have a long way to go before it truly is a justice system, a just system in this country. So the criminal legal system, and we're going to look at what's that intersection between the criminal legal system across employment, across housing, across education, across health. We know that there's an intersection and you can't separate any of those things. But excited to welcome the panel. I'd love for you to introduce yourselves to the group that is tuned in with us today, and then we'll get into the conversation. So I'm going to start with who's sort of first on my screen. So we'll start with Reverend Philip Cooper, if you'll introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and I'm blessed and grateful to be here. I gotta say, God is good, because anytime I'm on panels like this to talk about being a voice for the people we talk about, I have to say God is good, because if it had not been for the Lord on my side, I could have been dead from an overdose, violence, who knows? And so He chose to have me be a vessel and be able to use my testimony to help others, and I'm here for it. So I'm a North Carolina native, from Western North Carolina too. My family got rural roots, but we throw down in the rural areas too. You did. And I come from a dysfunctional family, but praise God, both my mom and dad turned their lives around and got engaged in recovery. I made some poor choices in life. I ended up doing some time, and while in prison, I was reinvented. It wasn't a reinvention by way of great programs from the system. Let's be clear. But what I will say is the brotherhood that was established when I was behind the wall, that contributed to the change, that contributed to the reinvention. And so I have emphasized the importance of iron sharpens iron, and I have emphasized the importance of lived experience since I've been home in March the 5th of 2011. And so I'm a founder of Operation Gateway, which is a nonprofit. Our mission is together we leverage lived experience to transform lives and reduce the stigma on recovery and reentry. And we support people coming out of incarceration, people coming out of long-term treatment. Slaying stigma is what we do, because we know mental health is health. And I'm grateful to be here amongst my colleagues from all over the nation.
Thank you so much. Reverend Ciera, if you would introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Reverend Ciera Bates-Chamberlain, the Executive Director of Live Free Illinois. Live Free Illinois is a faith-based organization where we organize over 130 congregations working at the intersection of public safety and criminal justice reform. A part of our work includes not only our organizing and policy work, where we address issues such as police accountability, gun violence, and also criminal justice reform. We also have the Decarceration Fellowship, where we work with individuals recently released from IDOC, as working to train them and support them in organizing and their reentry. And then finally, we have a Community Healing Resource Center network, which is a network of creating a culture of healing across the state of Illinois.
You don't do much at all, Reverend Sierra. Man, thank you so much for that introduction. Minister Server.
Thanks so much, love, people. I am Mr. Server. I'm based in Atlanta, Georgia, originally from Atlantic City, New Jersey. I'm known as a hip hop cultural strategist. I started in Atlanta with one of the first hip hop collectives in Atlanta, Nation Time Syndicate, which is 1992. Went to ministry school. My last year in ministry school, I was hired by KRS-One to be a spiritual advisor and the international organizer of the Temple Hip Hop movement. Here in Atlanta, after I resigned from the Temple and came back to Atlanta, I founded Higher Infinite Power Healing Our People Ministries, Hip Hop Ministries, which we use hip hop. You know, I tell people in hip hop, every spiritual path already exists. So it's not about trying to convince, convert, or convert anyone to any religion. And yet we can't look at hip hop and what we've done in less than about 52 years now without any force, without any formal plan, without limited resources, without seeing God in it. You know what I'm saying? God is in there somewhere, whatever name you want to call him, her. It's so hip hop ministries allows people to get in when they fit in spiritually. I'm also the founder and spiritual program director of Hip Hop Bridge Builders. Now, Hip Hop Bridge Builders, we are a political, cultural, educational movement based here in Atlanta. Hip hop is beyond entertainment. You know, we study at least 10 elements in hip hop, and we use hip hop as life strategies for self identification, self improvement, self empowerment, which ultimately leads to positive social change. So that's the work that we do. And I'm also known as the dopest hip hop grandpa. Word.
Awesome. Thank you, Minister Server. And finally, to round out the panelists, Marlon Richardson.
Peace to everybody. Really blessed and highly favored to be here with you all today. My name is Marlon Richardson. I go by the artist name UnLearn the World, originally from New York City, now based here in Oakland, California, Bay Area. Hip hop artist, producer, overall hip hop creative, but more particularly in this iteration, a hip hop educator, proud executive director of Hip Hop for Change. We are an Oakland-based nonprofit organization, 5013C3, that specializes in the preservation of true and authentic hip hop culture, but also exposing young kids, kindergarten to 12th grade, to all the expressive elements of hip hop as a healthy form of self-expression, community empowerment, and community building. So really happy to be with you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marlon. And you know, your program specifically, when you talk about young people and, you know, Reverend Sierra, and our conversation that we had in preparation for this, really talking about young people. One of my favorite quotes by Frederick Douglass, and it's one of my favorites because it resonates so well with, I think, the work that needs to continue, is it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. And so I have a deep appreciation for where you're starting, you know, with the young folks. So let's get into the questions. I'd love to start with Reverend Phillip. Actually, this is going to be for the entire panel. We're going to give everybody an opportunity to kind of weigh in on this question. So anybody can jump in first on this one. The criminal legal system in the United States has deep roots in racial control and punishment. How do you define community-centered justice reform, and why is it so critical right now?
Well, since you did say my name, I'm here for it. So I'm gonna mention the economic impact, right? So we talk about breaking generational curses. I like to talk about how there are some generational trades that get passed down as it relates to high demand industries in the workforce. And, addressing workforce development is a strategy for violence prevention because oftentimes you see the violence happening in poverty stricken areas, you dig? And so I was at a breakfast yesterday morning with some ministers, and we were sitting in a place called Cracker Barrel. And while we was in there enjoying our pancakes and fried eggs and steak, I looked over and I seen a long table full of white men. And outside of Cracker Barrel was the trucks for the anonymous company that they was working for. There was old men, there were middle-aged men, there were young men. Some were apprentices, some had been on the job for a long time. I guarantee you they was related somehow. That's what I call generational trades. When I think of reform, and I think of it from a economic impact. I think about how can we get the trades in the hands of these little black boys that are gonna get out of incarceration and need a career job instead of just telling them to go wash dishes somewhere, instead of telling them that only thing that they can do is be an assembler at the manufacturer as opposed to a degreed engineer, right? And so what reform looks like is making sure that people have access to these trainings even behind the walls. What I see is a lack of access to these trainings while people are incarcerated. And when the prisons do want to add programs, they oftentimes just add something that's an easy check the box as opposed to something that is a high demand industry. I have a degree that I got when I got out of prison, but what I will tell you is if I would have known about some of those other opportunities, I may have went another way. It was God's will for me to be a community health worker, for me to be a minister, for me to be active boots on the ground. But when I think about some of the careers that some of the people that I'm connected to that are formerly incarcerated, that are thriving, that are now homeowners, right? A lot of them working in industries where if they would have had access to the foundational trainings when they was incarcerated, they would have been able to have a thriving career whenever they got out of prison instead of being, behind the times trying to get a trade and things like that. So when I think of reform, from a community centered reform, I think of how we, the community, need to have access to these trainings and access to have say so. Right, to have say so about what industries the people that are incarcerated need to be tapping into, because the baby boomers are retiring. And from the data that I've heard from the economists, they don't have enough people to fill the jobs. And who else better to tap into than those people who are incarcerated?
Thanks, Reverend Cooper. Who else? Whoever wants to jump in, jump in.
I want to add. I think just to echo everything Reverend Cooper is saying, right? I think trade skills and job placement is very much part and parcel of everything that we're talking about, right? Well, we touched on community reform, violence reduction, crime reduction, and I think ultimately what the core of a lot of the things, in addition to having job opportunities that are not just relegated to either playing basketball or being in the world of entertainment, especially for young men of color. I think what we're focusing on, or what should be focused on, is the actual term community reform, right? And individual reform as well. Right. One of the things that would help reduce violence in our communities is our abilities to communicate with each other and our abilities to speak to each other and allow ourselves and facilitate environments where young men of color, young women of color, collectively or all individually, can sit and allow themselves to be vulnerable, can sit and allow themselves to express ideas that aren't immediately thwarted or dismissed or scoffed at or ridiculed or overly examined or disciplined. I think our young people need that space to be themselves authentically and to be given tools by mentors in the community to ultimately figure out how to articulate their desires, not just to the world, but to themselves, right? So rather than, oh, this person did me wrong, I'm now going to not communicate my needs and find some way to get them back or clap back or sabotage. Those are the kind of things that escalate issues, right? But I think our ability to communicate is what allows us to then de-escalate things, keep things from turning violent, keep individuals who are angry with a righteous anger, I would add as well, right? Considering the environments that we're left to live in, considering how a lot of our communities look and are under-resourced almost by design, arguably, you could say. There's a righteous anger. But I think it is incumbent upon us as elder statesmen within the culture of hip hop or in the Black community in general, for us to really be able to harness that anger in a way that is productive, in a way that we're able to communicate eloquently. And even if it's not so eloquent, right? I'm from a hip hop generation. I'm from the world of hip hop. Sometimes it's not going to be eloquent. Sometimes it's going to be a lot of emotion that speaks to a truth. And as long as it speaks to a truth in a constructive way, I think that we can facilitate spaces that allow for that truth to be expressed, for us to receive it, and for us to be inspired by those truths that are expressed to create environments where communication is key, but then also to take advantage of all the things that Reverend Cooper was saying.
Thank you. Minister Server, Reverend Ciera, you want to jump in on that question?
Yep. Can you repeat it?
Yes, absolutely. So the criminal legal system in the U.S. has deep roots in racial control and punishment. How do you define community-centered justice reform, and why is it so critical now?
Sure. I'll hop in. So first, I would say one, we have really been socialized into believing that accountability is punishment, and accountability doesn't necessarily equate to punishment. And so now this is why we have this punitive culture into where even in criminal justice reform and public safety, law enforcement and that system is centered instead of centering people. And so with that being said, I do want to just uplift a few quick things. So about 62 to 69% of this country identify as Christian. I can't speak to other religions, but I can speak to what I believe. And as a Christian, I know that we believe in grace. We believe in second chances. So it's interesting that majority of this country can identify to a faith that is founded upon grace, and yet the system that we have adopted is so punitive. It really doesn't make sense. There's another poll that went out that says that over 85% of people in America believe that the criminal justice reform system should be rehabilitative and not punitive. But again, we have a punitive infrastructure. And so I think the work that we have to do is to make sure that we are decentering law enforcement and punitive strategies from what we think is accountability and public safety. And when we center community, and when we center the fact that we have to treat people humanely, and when we have to also, as we're decentering law enforcement and we're taking away capitalism out of the equation as well, because again, that I believe will bring us to a space to where we're really centering people, and not this country figuring out how we profit off of the backs of people. And what that looks like is investment in root cause issues. What that looks like is that we actually have people receiving the resources and the supports and help that they need to thrive and be in healthy and whole communities.
Thank you for that. And, to your point, I don't think there's any other system when we think about the collective systems that we rely on or that we are impacted by is more dehumanizing than the criminal legal system.
Yes.
So, Minister Server.
Yes, I definitely agree with everything that was said by my esteemed panelists. And to add on to that, when we talk about community, we're talking about, like, when you think about community, there's no real community that we can call ourselves a part of if we're not actively participating in that community. So, within hip hop itself, we are an international culture. And yet, when you look at the Black community, a number of Black people may love rap music, but they're not looking at hip hop culture as strategies to move them forward from that. So depending on the community we talk about justice reform, the community has to see itself a certain kind of way. There has to be, hip hop is multi-generational now. You know what I'm saying? So for us to only look at it from one way, doesn't benefit us now as the elders, and most certainly doesn't benefit the children. So when we talk about justice, what does justice look like to us from our lens? Not from the eyes of our enemies and the system, particularly when it comes to hip hop, that we've been under attack from a number of group of people, even within the Black community. Since we've been in existence. I mean, now, in the last maybe 10, 20 years, we're starting to be respected a little bit more with things going into the academia and things of that nature. But at the core of hip hop, it's about underserved people. It's about people that have been oppressed, people that are marginalized. So what does justice really look like? That's the thing that as a community, we have to come to some agreement on what that looks like so we can have those systems of reform that we are controlling. And it's not something that's punitive. It is something that I agree with Reverend Ciera that there has to be room for redemption. There has to be room for people that have, even if you've done something, not that there are plenty of people that are incarcerated that haven't done anything, but even for the ones that have done something, there has to be room for redemption to move back. And we're talking about justice and reform. And I think, when we look at the way that we're in position right now to have a broader view of how that look, the thing I appreciate about hip hop is past, present, and future at the same time, because we are so young as a culture. So we're in a position now to be open to some solutions that maybe for whatever reason previous generations haven't been open to. But that's where I think we are winning around the world. Word.
Thank you for that. And that was a great lead in to the next question around reform. There are a lot of people that support reform in theory, right? There are a lot of folks who I think want to explore, what reform can look like. However, reform requires capital. It requires commitment. It requires uncomfortability. And so, I'd love to hear from you all, what things in regards to reform have you seen that have been are working, that heard folks that are being impacted, or what have you seen as an idea that has been significant, that is working?
Well, I'll go back to what I said about lived experience, and I'm all about mental health. And I claim that community health worker title quicker than any of the other credentials that I have, because community health workers focus on root causes, and it focuses on empowering the community to serve as links, liaisons, and what qualifies those community leaders as trust. And so let's state the community health worker model as an evidence-based model that works, that first dimension. And when I think about mental health, right, man, a lot of people are self-medicating because they haven't found somebody to trust that they trust to talk to about what's really going on. And I've seen this whenever I was in prison. This is the first place I seen that it was working was in prison with this program called A New Direction, and it's under for the behavioral health folks that's on this or that's watching may have heard of Hazelden, right? So Hazelden has a program called A New Direction that they use in the prison, and they use something called peer counselors. And so I was a peer counselor when I was in prison. It's like a person that's doing time right with you, but it's a positive person. They can help you with making sure you get your assignments done and try to keep the peace in the dorm. And so I seen the value of lived experience when I was in prison. And then when I came home, I kept that same energy. I went to the community college, got my 2-year degree. I learned about motivational interviewing. I learned about crisis intervention, mental health first aid, suicide prevention. I learned about, how the stigma was impacting people. And like I remember people used to talk about me because I took medication, right? And where I come from, and where in a lot of Black homes, it's like what goes on in this house stays in this house. Don't tell nobody what's going on. And when I think about the impact from that on generations, as we talk about generational curses, as we talk about adverse childhood experiences, there's a lot of things that people ain't even healed from. And so you got these people out there doing damage because they've been traumatized and they haven't received any healing. They haven't had any. Some people call them safe spaces. I like to call them brave spaces. And so what I have been seeing work is these trainers and these credentials that are empowering formerly incarcerated people, people who are in recovery, to leverage their own recovery to help other people. And that's working, y'all. Now, many of us took some cuts though. With the budget impact, we got hit, but the work was working. Like I've seen people go from doing that assessment, like they know I'm in mental health recovery. So I asked them, have you ever taken mental health meds before? And they willing to tell me the truth. Like, yeah, man, I used to take this for schizophrenia, or I used to take this for bipolar. And the next thing you know, I'm saying, yeah, bro, I take my Wellbutrin for depression and anxiety. And it also it helps with my attention deficit. And then they start to feel it's a brave space to talk about what's going on. Next thing you know, they getting the therapy that they need, and they may or may not be taking medicine again. But let's be real. A lot of times people stop taking their medicine because they was doing other drugs. And so I see people, once they have connected with somebody that has lived experience, that have had the proper training to know how to tell their story, who knows how to implement motivational interviewing practices, and the next thing you know, these people are getting the healing that they need. And I can't forget to say this: mental health is health, y'all. Mental health is health, y'all. And we got to continue to recover out loud. And shout out to the celebrities that's starting to talk more and more about mental health. You know, shout out to the people in hip hop that's starting to talk more and more about mental health. Like my brother Minister Service said, you know, so like even my bro, what's his name? G Herbo talk about mental health. Charlamagne the God talk about mental health. You got Taraji P. Henson talk about mental health. A lot of people who are talking about mental health out loud, and they normalizing that thing, man. Normalizing going to see a therapist. And guess what? Therapy is for the strong.
You just said a word, sir.
No, I want to echo what Reverend Cooper was saying with regard to mental health being kind of at the forefront and the foundation of reform, right? But I think in order for us to get the access point, right, we need the training. We need to normalize and emphasize and encourage training, whether it's a social worker or a counselor, or even one of the practices we have here at Hip Hop for Change is that all of the local artist educators that we train to be in the classroom, to be mentors, are trained in dynamic mindfulness as well as trauma-informed care. They're given their own ACEs test for them to understand how their own adverse childhood experiences have impacted them as artists and as people. But then further to that, we're giving them personality tests for them to understand who they are at a very core level and what kind of opportunities professionally can they have. But more particularly, what kind of lived experiences can they speak to serve as a mentor and to facilitate those spaces where mental health can be encouraged and maintained. And I think it's important for us as a community to kind of not only remove the stigma of trying to gain services for mental health, but also to remove the hierarchy that comes with some people being almost ashamed to convey their story or tell their story to somebody in a social worker position or somebody in a therapeutic position who's now responsible for determining your mental wellness and whether or not you're going to be, heavily surveilled during your probation or if you're going back to jail or, these are things that are also considered. The mental wellness aspect of incarceration is very key. But aside from incarceration, before we even get there, I think it's important for us to have these kind of spaces and to have well-trained individuals in the community that are able to speak to the needs the mental health needs of young people particularly, but by extension, everyone in the community who may be suffering from things. This society that we exist in is overwhelming. Let's just kind of establish that. And I think there are many pockets throughout the course of our society where young people of color are more adversely impacted as to the impact of this society than other populations, right? We are the most vulnerable in many cases. We are the ones who bear the brunt first. Poor people bear the brunt first when the economy is doing bad. Poor people are bearing the brunt first when there's a health crisis. They're the ones first impacted because sometimes they don't have health insurance. And part of having health insurance is part of having mental health insurance, right? I think in California, we created a mental health parity where you had to have mental health included in your benefits package if you were an employee who had access to medical benefits. It was included. So things with regard to mental health, I think, are very much the front line of reform before we start to think about anything. We have to heal the trauma that comes with living in the kind of society that we live in, and that continues to impact us one way or another. And if it's not trauma, on one side, it's grief, right? Grief, even in successful instances, people who seemingly have a lot of worldly success or communal success, there's a grief that comes with people like that because they're burdened with having to take care of their families, take care of their friends, right? Having to make these discerning decisions about who gets to stay in proximity to their life when they have to move on, right? Away from communities that kind of reared them, but now they're in a different space. There's a survivor's grief that comes with that, along with all the unprocessed, unhealed trauma. So people can have all the monetary success in the world and still have their soul lost by the excess of money, fame, popularity, whatever the case is, capitalism as a whole. So I think it's really important for us to emphasize and normalize taking care of one's mental health. And that doesn't necessarily need to be therapy. It can be something as simple as taking care of your physical body, going to the gym, talking with a friend, facilitating those spaces again where community can converge and we can have a good time rapping, dancing, talking, laughing, cooking for each other, things of that nature. There needs to be more communal aspects of our communities. And I think mental health is at the forefront of it.
Thank you. Both of you touched on, data that came up in our report, particularly around Black boys and suicide. And those numbers have gone in the wrong direction, particularly with the onset of COVID-19, during the pandemic. And so I appreciate both of you speaking to that. I do want to, Reverend Ciera, with your Live Free Illinois program, you work at the intersection of policy and lived experience. And so when we're thinking about, reform and things that are working and solutions that, ultimately come from the community, what have you seen that has worked or that has been really impactful in your work?
Sure. So I would say, how we say you got to walk and chew bubble gum at the same time? That is what we have to do. A lot of times it seems as if with particularly Black people that we're expected to only think that we can address one issue or resource one or two issues at a time. And in order to see the transformation that we need all of this to happen. There's been so much suffering and pain and trauma that it doesn't unravel, or we don't heal by playing whack-a-mole with our issues. And so while mental health is extremely important, that's why we do a lot of the community healing resource center work that we need so that we can create a culture of health and get to a healthy space mentally, collectively as a community. We also have to think about the politics in our communities to create those healthy environments. We can't keep medicating the outcomes of an unjust environment for our people. So how are we, one, even beyond advocating to organizers advocating on the issues that we care about, we have to put our own people in place. We have to make sure that we're holding people accountable and that we're organizing and building power so that we can have the resources that we need in community to be whole and healthy. We need to make sure that we have our education system that is equitable, healthcare, food, all of the wraparound services and things that people have in healthy communities. We have to make sure that our communities have that. In addition to that, because those are root cause solutions that oftentimes take a long time to advocate for because they have been divested and stripped from our communities for so long, we also have to make sure that we're advocating for the resources that we need right now, that we're budgeted to have violence reduction programs that are community centered, that we have the reentry resources that we need, that we're passing policies like clean slate so that people can have access to opportunities and they're not barred from opportunities and resources because they have records on their backs, and we can pass laws to make sure that we're removing barriers. We have to literally chew bubble gum and walk at the same time and make sure that we're doing all of this because it's going to take a comprehensive approach to make sure that our people are getting the relief that we need to thrive.
Well, someone in the chat said preach. Reverend Ciera. So yes, I appreciate you bringing in the now, like what's needed now, and then also really thinking about, you know, how to sustain this and what's needed to create true transformation, right? So that we're not just kind of marking time, because as Minister Server talked about, you know, there's three generations kind of in the hip hop realm, and so those solutions and those ideas and those needs can look very different from what, you know, I would need and, you know, what my kids might need. So Minister Server, can you speak to, you know, when you're thinking about reform and you're thinking about solutions, and I want to delve a little bit into that generational piece and what solutions, you know, that you have seen or talked through.
Yeah, definitely. You know, hip hop manifests itself because of the trauma of white supremacy and racism, and we can't ever forget that. You know, so when you talk about dealing with Black and brown people, hip hop manifests itself after that. So one of the solutions have always been organizations. When we talk about the Universal Zulu Nation, it was started to turn the negative situations that people were dealing with in the New York and the Bronx particularly, and have positive outcomes. So we took the ancient art forms of breaking, MCing, graffiti, and DJing and used those to literally stop gang violence. You know what I'm saying? So the organizations have been around and are still around. So that's one thing that I encourage people, get involved in some type of organization. See, because, you know, there's no lack of problems that we need to deal with, but none of them can be dealt with on an individual basis. So, you know, back when we were talking about community, when you're talking about your family structure and you're talking about, you know, we come from the era where we used to say it takes a whole village to raise a child. I question whether we still have that consciousness now, because a number of times, particularly when it comes to hip hop, you know, we as the elders sometimes are not invested enough into our young people to have the type of reforms that they need in their personal spaces, in their educational spaces, in their spiritual spaces. We have not really added on to that in a way because we're still kind of stuck in our ways. So I think when we're talking about solutions, organizations, whether it's political, you know, Hip Hop Caucus has been dealing with, you know, the voting systems and giving people that are formerly incarcerated their voting rights back. You know, you can look at the things that are happening on the educational side. So there's a number of organizations that are already doing the solutions. The challenge is the entertainment industry has no care about that at all. So most of the time when people think about hip hop, they're thinking about rap music, mainstream negative rap music for the most part. So I think we have to, you know, conversations like this, panels like this are really important to get that word out and say that those solutions are already happening. It's a matter of people looking for the solutions to add on to what they're already doing. We don't need to recreate the wheel. Everything that has been going on, the work of our ancestors, we're still doing that work. You know, we're just calling it hip hop now. There's nothing new that we're doing. And we, you know, 45 and older, we know that more than anyone else. So I think it's our responsibility to find ways to add on to the work of the ancestors through this culture. And there are a number of organizations that you can do that. So that's the first thing that I would say for the solution. Find an organization that matches where you are, matches your consciousness, matches with the way that you want to see the world. And if you have children and you have grandchildren, what I caution people is to be just like the ancestors and the elders. See beyond where we are right now. Be more visionary in the way that you want the world to be, whether you see it or not. Because I think that's one of the challenges that, you know, who would have ever thought 30 years ago that, you know, you would have billionaires within hip hop? And yet, has that really had a real effect on young Black people? That's a whole nother panel. But I'm just saying, we got to join organizations so we can really, I like what Reverend Ciera said about accountability. You know, and somewhere along the line, that became a bad word in the Black community. Whereas we need to bring that forward again because, you know, we should be hold ourselves accountable to standards that, at the very least, match the work of the ancestors.
Thank you for that, Minister Server. You know, this is bringing me to a question around, you know, we heard Reverend Phillip earlier talking about funding, right? And so North Carolina, where we both reside, we have still not yet passed a state budget. Our General Assembly has still not yet passed a state budget. And, you know, between where each of the panelists are located, you know, I'm sure that you all have seen a retreat in funding, particularly around the attacks on DEI, the attacks on education, the healthcare system. But beyond funding, what is, you know, your perspective on one of the biggest barriers to actually achieving or moving closer to a more just criminal legal system? And anybody can jump in on this one.
I think humanization, first and foremost, right? We're talking about a criminal legal system, right, as opposed to a justice system that's founded on the exploitation and the extraction of Black bodies. And this is something that historically we understand. When you look at how police were formed in this country, when you look at how the criminal justice system played itself out throughout the course of the crack epidemic or post-Reconstruction, you're seeing a system that was designed to criminalize young people of color in general, or just people in color in general, Black people in particular. So it's important to understand that history, because in that history lies the motive of the system itself. I think self-determination is important in this, in terms of how do we create mechanisms within our communities to police ourselves and to provide resources within the community that that prevent the legal system to have to interfere, right? Where there's a mental health crisis as opposed to a criminal crisis, so that mental health professionals are called as opposed to police officers. So we don't have problems where someone's having a mental health crisis and they're accidentally shot because the police officer involved doesn't know how to communicate with somebody who is dealing in a mental health crisis, more particularly is dealing with the mental health crisis in a Black community that they're not from, right? And they don't know how often this happens. They don't know that that's, you know, somebody's grandson from down the block who may be able to intervene. They don't know the dynamic. So that ignorance of not knowing how to move in certain communities, I think exacerbates a lot of the problems that we're confronting. You know what I'm saying? But I think ultimately we're dealing with a system that is part of a larger system, which is capitalism, right? And capitalism is a mechanism of white supremacy. And I think that when we look at that, and it's important to look at that, because that is the filter by which we are viewed. And it's important for us to be viewed, to understand how we are viewed in many cases. Whether or not we fit the description or play into that role is another conversation. And all too often we don't. I think young Black boys are viewed as older than they are, as stronger than they are, more tolerable to pain. Same thing with Black women and Black girls. We're seen as these physically super enduring group of people, right? But also at the same time, they have to reconcile, or they try to reconcile their other stereotypes of us, of weak-minded, feeble, things of that nature. So it's important to view that and to fight against that. Often I'm going into schools as an educator, and I'm speaking to the value of hip hop and culturally responsive pedagogy. And I find myself often in a trust deficit because of the stereotypes that are attached to hip hop music and culture based on what we see on television and on mainstream media outlets. And most of these principles that I'm speaking to, they're not there to understand that this is corporate co-opted hip hop that's ran by predominantly white men in suits in corporate buildings that are determining the next trend for young Black kids. They're not, that conversation isn't being had. They know what they know, and perception becomes reality for them. So they talk to me in a certain way. They treat the programming in a certain way. We have a higher standard of discipline and being on time than maybe the folk singer who came as an arts educator. So a lot of the time it plays into just programming for kids in educational spaces. So I think it's important for us to know how we're viewed when we walk into certain spaces or certain systems that are designed not to work for us. Right? The legal system in America is not designed to work for vulnerable people of color and communities of color. It's never been designed that way. In fact, it's been designed the opposite way for us to serve almost as an economic driver for these for these investment funds and whatever who have investments in the prison industrial complex, be it public or private. There's a financial incentive to depict us a certain way, to then have the criminal justice system use us in a certain way. And understanding that very sobering reality gives us at least some level of emotional urgency to start developing the community-based solutions that we're talking about, right? So that we're self-determined, we keep within our own, and we can avoid at all costs entering into a legal system that doesn't have our best interests in mind. So what does that look like? It looks like community policing. It looks like alternative intervention mechanisms, de-escalation, nonviolent communication, but more particularly restorative justice practices. And that starts in schools, right?
And that
Where kids
is,
are being, yeah, where
I'll
kids are
say to
being
you,
expelled or
Marlon,
suspended. Yeah.
the restorative justice practices, and as we're kind of still talking about some of those barriers, I would love to hear, particularly with Operation Gateway, and then Reverend Ciera, in your program, how have you implemented those restorative justice practices, and do you see those as even barriers?
Well, I'm gonna keep going back to the issues that I experienced, my own lived experience, as well as what I'm seeing with people that look like me now. And I've heard the talks about restorative justice, and for me, when I think of restorative justice, we got to be addressing the root causes of crime, the root causes of violence. And so I'm gonna always go back to workforce development, and I'm gonna always remind the Department of Labor about how the numbers for Black people are down when it comes down to securing portable credentials where they can have a trade, a skill, or whatnot. So we always need to have a community college at the table when we're talking about improving health outcomes for people and checking them on their data on how many people that are Black and and I don't want to keep saying Black and brown, because that's another problem too when we want to categorize everybody in the same group, because like I see a lot of browns that be killing the game in the trades, they be killing the game in constructions and things like that. So like I'm gonna say for Blacks, with Operation Gateway, what we did, we got a grant from the BJA, fam. We got a grant from the BJA. Shout out to the Urban League too for being the lead agency, because we a smaller nonprofit. And to get them federal grants, you got to have like a certain operating budget and been in existence. So shout out to the Urban League for being the lead agency on this. But we got a BJA grant, and we prioritize connecting with Black men coming out of prison and getting them connected into workforce development opportunities. But I'm gonna go right back to how Brother Marlon responded, like, because you remember in the beginning I started to talk about workforce development, and then my brother took us right to mental health to talk about how people gonna be able to maintain and retain them jobs, because we got to work on the mental. We got to make sure it's trauma informed. And for us, the way we doing it is we looking at the role that the community health workers play in being liaisons, but also making sure it's safe for our people when they go to these jobs. So restorative justice looks like being a voice at the table across all sectors. Like, and as a community health worker, we kind of like coordinators of the ecosystem. You know what I'm saying? Because we're not in one section. We're not just, education and training. We're not just healthcare. We're not just providing halfway houses or residential reentry programs. We're not just doing peer support groups, but we're helping navigate these resources across the board. So when I look at restorative justice, we got to have that same trauma informed mindset, that addressing root causes mindset, no matter what sector we're dealing with. Whether we talk about housing and looking at the policies that keep people from being able to rent there because of their backgrounds, or whether we talk about at the community college where you might see a staff member that's been there, been working there forever, and they ain't trying to do but so much work. And here we come with our referrals. You better get to work. As my daughter would say, clock it. Because we ain't playing. We here for the people. And we know if economic impact is something that needs to be addressed and held accountable, then that's what we gonna do. That's what we gonna do. And then also when I look at it too, let's talk about the behavioral health workforce, in which it's not a lot of black people in the behavioral health workforce. And so for us, restorative justice look like providing training stipends for those black people that are going to get these credentials. Oh, you going to get a 50-hour peer support training? We're going to give you $750 when you finish, because this is how you level the playing field. That's what they call earn while you learn. You dig? That's what they call work-based learning. And then we got an apprenticeship at Operation Gateway, in which if a person don't have their high school diploma but they have the recovery time to be a peer support, and they got the personality, they got the humility, they got the mindset, we got an apprenticeship to where a person can even be doing earn while you learn to work on your GED. And we had one that was that got their GED while they was on the clock with us. You feel me? This is tangible ways to address this thing. And so when I think of restorative justice, it's gonna always go back to that mental health, and it's gonna always go back to that workforce development piece, because a lot of times men, they want to provide. When we in prison, we miss our kids. We want to get out and be able to take our kids to get some ice cream, take our kids to Chick-fil-A, whatever. Providing gives us a lot of purpose. And so if we can't help these men be able to provide, be able to participate in the economic mainstream, they gonna go back to what they was doing before. And so with that grant, shout out to the BJA. We got that grant and we've been operating it. And I always got to give a props to the Urban League for being the lead agency. And then with the funds that we have with what I was talking about with the training stipends, this is where you operationalize what they call workforce equity. Okay, that's the way you operationalize it, by providing those work-based learning opportunities for those people that's in the community that's already trusted. And I'm gonna say this and shut up. My brother said earlier, we got the resources in community. Now we got to get them the proper training. Restorative justice looks like making sure these people got the training that they need. You know what I'm saying? Because what can happen is when the system pick and choose who they want to use as partners, if they don't provide the proper training and this said organization don't show up right, then they're gonna try to say, nah, we tried it before and it ain't worked. But nah, make sure we ready before you try to put us in the game.
Thank you. Y'all are dropping some nuggets. I'm telling you, the chat is going crazy. And one of my good sisters in the field uses this analogy about the fishbowl, and she talks about making sure that the fishbowl can actually take care of the fish that you decide to place in the fishbowl, that the environment is ready. You have the right type of water, you have the right type of lighting, that the feeding is happening at whatever time. But it's basically saying, you can't stick a whole bunch of fish in the bowl and you haven't created the conditions for them to thrive and survive. So Reverend Ciera, I'd love to hear your take on restorative justice, and also adding in, what you see, beyond what we've heard, any other critical barriers.
Sure. And you was all up in my comments around the fishbowl because I was gonna give a quick analogy. But in my what changed my career trajectory was my social work professor talked about the fishbowl and he said that, and I'll never forget this day. He said that you can take the fish out of the fishbowl, clean the fish up, but if you put that fish back into dirty water, you constantly cleaning that fish up and putting them back into the same environment has done nothing. You got to clean the fish bowl so that the fish could be healthy. And I changed my whole career trajectory from a therapist to policy. Um, but with that being said, when I think about restorative justice, I think it's a critical practice that we have to infused into our accountability system, into our public safety system. I think that it is also around how we are looking to restore or to transform and reimagine how we're restoring relationship and what community transformation looks like. And I think the restorative justice is an integral practice within that we have to continue to adopt, and children should no, in my belief system, those are things that children in schools should have to learn, because we spent, again, so much time being conditioned to one way of how we hold each other accountable, and it's been this very punitive culture. And so we have to recondition ourselves as a society and community so that we can be and see the type of change that we want. I think I'm going to go back to when we talk about the barriers and what we need. I'm going to go back to the community organizing pieces of it, because none of this happens without us making sure that we're creating the political will for this to happen. I think that when we're talking about those who are justice impacted, we know that these are also, and we are living in communities who have been excluded from the civic and the democracy process, and that is very intentional. It's very intentional that our people are not voting. It's very intentional that our people are not organizing and building the space so that we can create the type of culture and communities that we want to see. And so the biggest thing that I feel like the other side or the alternative thought has done is not only incarcerate our people, or not only create provisions to where we have a unimaginable amount of illegal guns flowing into our communities. Not only did they create the environment and the culture for that, but they've also sort of fed into this piece that has isolated our people from being a part of our democracy process. And that has deeply hurt us. And I think as even digging into the report and really like looking into this conversation, as we're thinking about like what does that look like for Black men? Like, why do Black men feel like they're excluded from the process, to the fact that many of our young people feel like they don't want to vote, they don't want to participate, because it's already a set agenda or a set rule. And even Black elected officials could be seen as more so concerned about how they're capitalizing off of elections versus making sure that they're fighting in spaces for our people. And so I want to go back and say, like, yes, we need all of these things. We need community. We need people to care. But we need people to care enough to come together as a community so that we can create the community that we need through the channels that we know that we can make that work, again, through voting and accountability processes. But it's very difficult when we created this culture when it's about what's in front of my front door. Very difficult to where people aren't concerned about incarceration or gun violence or any other the other crises and issues, people being unhoused, people dealing with food insecurity, until it knocks on their front door. So we have to reestablish a sense of community, and recreate that culture. And some of that is simply is Black clubs. Like, do we have Black clubs in community? Like, how many people actually know their neighbors and are reestablishing those connections in community? People who are engaged with their local school system. There's a lot of community that has been broken down in Black spaces that we have to rebuild. And as we're rebuilding community, we also have to rebuild the power to put a demand on creating the systems and level of accountability and justice that we want to see. I think our roles go back to organizing and power building.
Thank you so much, Reverend Ciera. There's so many threads that are connecting. I'm thinking about, something that Marlon said earlier about how we see ourselves. I think about, Minister Server talking about the narrative, right? Reverend Cooper, you have talked about, the stigma And so I want to dig a little bit deeper, and I want to start with you, Minister Server, in it sounds like, and please correct me if I'm wrong, hold me accountable. It sounds like the changing of the narrative and the empowerment strategies have a dual role. There's the internal changing of the narrative and empowering, and there's the external. So could you speak a little bit to that and how your focus and your work in hip hop can address both of those?
Yeah, most certainly. It's definitely internal and external. My challenge is for those of us that are 45 and older that experience hip hop in a way that no one ever will, because we're the ones that took the ancient elements and created this culture. So we have to kind of realign ourselves with what we know. I often tell people hip hop for us starts August 11th, 1973. The rap industry doesn't start till 79. So if you don't understand what was going on from 73 to 79, you don't really understand hip hop culture. You don't understand the essence of really what it was. It was created, there was no thought of it being this multi-billion-dollar industry as far as entertainment. It was created because young Black people and brown people were looking for ways to validate themselves, looking for ways to bypass the system that told them that they were worthless. When you look at what was happening in the Bronx, it was a symbol of what was happening to Black communities around the country. So you have these teenagers and young people. So we have to kind of, again, those of us that are 45 and older have to kind of realign ourselves with the essence. And the essence was about peace, love, unity, and safely having fun. That's what it was about more than anything else. And externally, now that we are older, we have to be able to point out the things that the effectiveness of the solutions that we know work. So in 1989, when we started to stop the violence movement, that's when we began to take accountability for ourselves and say we're not waiting for other people to come do for us. So from the different movements that are there, and yet still, I'm 61 years old with a track record, children in the whole nine, and yet when I say hip hop, there's still barriers that I have to jump over externally, just because based on the stereotype of what people hear. I tell people our enemy, the entertainment industry and the corporations have done an amazing job of making us forget what it really was. And I tell people one of my superpowers is just, I'm a good reminder. I don't have anything new to say. I don't have any new, programs that haven't been already tried and proven. But if we're not internally valuing ourselves, the world sometimes value us on what we can give to them, but if they can't eat off of us, if they can't take from us, they don't care about us. Whereas the essence of hip hop is about you being empowered to know that you can help to determine your own being. When you look at what we've been able to do in the world in only 52 years, the spiritual part has to be a part of that conversation internally and externally. And again, I don't get into people's religion. Your religion is none of my business. But you cannot negate that according to the United Nations, the fastest growing culture in the world is hip hop, because we can still bypass the systems and go directly to the people and empower the people. So those things that have to be done internally and externally, but I truly believe that has to start internally, particularly with those of us who I like to call that first generation, that 45 and older, and people who identify themselves as being a part of culture. I know people of almost every occupation that you can think of that became who they are because of the culture. And yet, because of the way that mainstream rap music sounds, they shut away from the culture. We have to change that internally, and that will affect what's happening externally.
Marlon, I'd love to hear your take as well. Thank you, Minister Server.
Yeah, I think, and at Hip Hop for Change, we do this in our songwriting class. We talk about the importance of storytelling and narratives, right? Stories instill narratives, and narratives are what shape our worldview. But I think on a physiological level, what we often don't speak about is the reason why stories and narratives are so vitally important is because those are the stories that we are telling ourselves, and those are the stories that are recurring in our nervous system, biologically speaking. Right? The stories you tell yourself about your own life, about the reality around you, lives in your nervous system and trains your nervous system as to how to respond to the reality that you exist in. And hip hop has been instrumental in allowing young marginalized people to recreate their own story. We often start with the premise that hip hop is remix culture, right? One of the very first rappers, Grandmaster Caz from the Cold Crush, said, Hip hop did not invent anything, it reinvented everything. So, from that lens, it's important that we use this culture, particularly, or this form of expression, as a means to remix ourselves in the environments that we live in, right? And I think it's this internal external conversation that we're having, that as within, so without. That you can understand if you understand like Hermetic philosophy and you want to get deep on that level. But I think at the core of it, what we're talking about is practices that allow us to reset our nervous system and environments that allow us to retell our stories, right? So how that looks for hip hop for change is, in addition to training our staff and our young people, we also train them in dynamic mindfulness, the idea of sitting still and breathing and knowing what it is to just listen to your own breath, being able to sit in the silence, right? Which in certain environments, silence is a luxury. We know that. Like, when you're surrounded by buses and trains and neighbors upstairs and domestic violence downstairs, or even in your household next door, the next room, silence becomes this luxury that often you're not able to find. Sleep is something that becomes a luxury that you're not able to find. You'd be very much surprised, or probably not, how many classrooms I go to at 8 o'clock in the morning and I'm doing energy level checks on a scale of 1 to 5. Rate your energy level, and all I get are ones or zeros. And I ask how many kids ate breakfast, and you barely see any hands up. How many kids slept more than 6 hours? Barely any hands up. So these little things, these little subtle things, are things that allow us to reset our own nervous system in order for us to navigate the reality that we're in. So having these little micro practices, even if we're having a political rally or a political meeting, taking 5 seconds to take a deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth can settle a whole crowd of people, especially if we're in unison, focused on a common goal, a common practice, and sharing in a breath. I think that does wonders just in terms of this physiology that allows us to then redefine ourselves and redefine the narratives that we want to see, and create communities where those narratives can be reinforced and articulated, right? Because it's not just us or me, Marlon Richardson, telling a story. It's how am I contributing to this larger story that, Reverend Phil can add to, or you know what I'm saying, or server minister can fit. How are we adding to this larger story that is our legacy, that is our collective experience in this society, and how we are adding value, how we are contributing, and how we are emboldened, empowered, and proud of who we are at our core and what we are able to contribute. Because once we're established a new space of pride for ourselves, you can't play with us like that, right? And this is what hip hop was amazing at doing. It allowed young kids to create or center themselves in a source of pride where you couldn't play with them. They were a little bit more rebellious because they were more emboldened. They had a whole community with them that allowed them to be their best selves, because now the narrative shifted within themselves. And I think that that's something that we're able to kind of just facilitate and then externalize to the rest of our communities.
And you all have spoken to this. Thank you for that, Marlon. And kind of what you closed with was this sort of, I know who I am, and it doesn't matter what you say. Like, I know who I am. And so when you think about these systems, that these criminal legal systems that have for so long, or were created to tell us who we were or who we were not. When you think about what opportunities have we not thought about? This is a question that I have wanted to ask the whole time. What are the things what's something that we haven't thought of? I mean, I know, the old folks say there's nothing new under the sun, right? And all of those things. And a lot of things are, that have been done continue to work. They just haven't been able to sort of live out their fullest potential because of, retreat of funding, the capitalist perspective. Folks have sort of figured out how to shift it to being about what they want versus being what it has been about. And something that Marlon, you spoke to earlier, the grief of community. Like when I grew up, so I grew up in the projects, until middle school. And regardless of how people, what their narratives are, what they say about the projects, we were a community. We had grandmamas, aunties looking out for, telling you what to do, telling on you, whooping your butt, like all the things. There were, of course, there were things that happened. However, I think that grief of community, because when you have the opportunity, as a parent, I think about the opportunity to move to a better area for better schools for my kids. We lost that sense of community. The folks in our community no longer looked like us, no longer had that shared lived experience. And so that grief and that loss of community, but I would love for you all to share, what are the things that we haven't necessarily thought about or touched on that you see as potentially a simple solution or something that needs to be dug in a little more. And then we'll dive into, we've got some questions in the Q&A. And then we'll do a wrap up. So anybody want to jump in on that? What's something that we haven't thought about, or something that you have dreamed about or thought about and was like, man, if I could do this one thing.
Yeah, I believe in the church, and I appreciate the mention from Minister Server about, the spiritual component, right? And I understand and I respect that everybody may not have the same faith tradition as me, but I will speak to the church. The church needs to be empowered. We need to continue to equip the saints. I am a trainer in Soul Shop, which is evidence-based. We have a training that is specifically for Black churches, and it's on the best practice registry, because we know that the church is a place where people go to whenever it hits the fan. When Hurricane Helene hit our area, the church showed up before FEMA. So the church going to show up. So it would behoove us to continue to get the church the appropriate trainings. And I appreciate how much, man, I'm actually learning more about hip hop myself, because I'm an 80s baby, right? And I know about hip hop, but some of the things that you even said with the stigma on hip hop are things that I done messed around and perpetuated. You feel me? And so thank you for that education. And I'm glad that I'm on this panel to not only be a voice, but also to learn. And I am a proud hip hop head, you dig? And I do believe that it's power in the music. But I also say that going back to the church, like training up the church, using it, repurposing some of the church real estate. Shout out to Reverend Ciera and what they doing in, Live Free, Illinois. I'm gonna be looking more into that, because I know there's so much potential in the church if we can just get people to sit down together, get the right trainings, and put the egos to the side. Because sometimes, the churches be gang banging, if you ask me, because this domination don't want to deal with that denomination. And so we got to figure out a way to get them good old church folks in the room, give them some evidence-based practices, and repurpose some of this real estate. Because there are tons of churches that are aging out. We can be using that space for affordable housing, for training, for nonprofit operations. And so let's figure out how we can continue to empower the church and equip the saints. That's what we say in Soul Shop. We equip the saints, and we train them as suicide prevention professionals. You know what I'm saying? And it requires a little bit of connections, a little bit of love, and a little bit of skill. Is all that's needed to do suicide prevention. Because oftentimes people are feeling they have a loss of hope, or they feel alone. And if the Church of Jesus Christ can't do something about a loss of hope and people feeling alone, then it need to shut its doors. And so this is where I feel we need to start putting more energy in, especially as Black people. Because and I was in this it was a celebration with Bank of America, right? And they was in there and they was teaching about not teaching, but they was sharing about volunteering and people and charitable giving. And the church continues to be the place where the most volunteering is happening and the most charitable giving is happening. But then comes this question: are the resources used to better address the root causes that we are talking about? And if we can get people in the same room and have that education, I believe the church can do way more.
Thanks, Reverend Phillip. Anybody else want to jump in on?
Yeah, I'll jump in. So I want to just come in and sort of speak to some of what Reverend Phillip was speaking to around the church. I also want to add that Live Free Illinois is a part of Live Free USA. Live Free USA is a national organization. So it's a Live Free USA in Oakland. You in Oakland, right, Phillip? Did I catch that right? So check us out. And there's a lot of ways that we can collaborate, because that's what needs to happen. It needs to be large scale collaboration. And I'm gonna lean into what the old folks say because I do believe that there's nothing new under the sun. Um, and I just think that though there are things that we just haven't figured out uh, as of yet. I think that it's happened some season of our cycles, but we haven't been there in this season, and that's being unified. Um, it's very difficult when we look at things. I don't think that everybody got it together, but it got to be something to where we as a people can have spaces to where we have $1 million blocks again, to where we have blocks that are making money in our communities that are driving the economics in our neighborhoods, not just in the city, but like literally in our neighborhoods, like other um, ethnicities have been able to do. I think we have to figure out how to be more connected as a people and not. Some of it is just the basics that we think that is not as profound. But when we talk about how we're not unified and there's a lot of times people are trying to step on each other to get ahead, like we literally have to bring back in love into our spaces. We have to cancel out culture. We've created this space to where we are the cancel people versus call them in with love. And as long as we're canceling folks out, that means that we're not able to strengthen the bonds that we need in order to build real power as a community. I think the piece of knowing who we are and knowing our stories, that comes through relationship. That comes through talking. That comes from us caring enough to identify somebody's self-interest, to identify their values, to figure out how we can collectively work together to move forward our collective interests. Like, although we've done it in small scales or we've done it in silos, there has not been a collective space to where us as a people have figured out how do we work together on and you know we hear this statement a lot, how some people can work, they may disagree on 100 issues, but they find that one thing that they agree on. Like, how do we do that? Like, how do we find the one or two things that we agree on, and we don't mess with the things that we don't agree on? I think those are the small things that we can do that will have a major impact in our Black communities, and we can scale that up. And the last thing about the church I would say is that I think that we're in a space to where it feels as if the Black church is sort of trying to be canceled out as well. And I do believe that the Black church in the not-for-profit space, in the movement space, in the healing space, whichever space that we're in, the Black church still has a very critical and vital role in our Black culture. And so we can't allow some of the bad things that we've heard or some of the mistakes that have been made to X out the power of the Black church, because the Black church is still the most powerful institutions in our communities, because we own the board, we own the money, we own the buildings. Like, those are our institutions, and we have to make sure that we're calling in the Black church into our spaces as well.
Thank you. Well, we have a couple of questions in the chat. Some of them speak to more around some funding strategies, and I think we can follow up on that. There was a question specifically, Philip, with Reverend Philip, with speaking about the flexibility that has allowed you to reimagine how funding has been received at Operation Gateway. And I think I would love for you to speak to that, and also tie it into how, from a larger scale, just in thinking about reimagining the criminal legal system when it comes to Black men and boys, if you could tie those two things together.
Yes, certainly. So one of the things that the way that God structured my life, I'm just gonna be real. Like, when I came home from prison, I went back to school for human services. I went into behavioral health. Then I burn out, right? Because they say if you go hard, take care of yourself, Philip. But I burn, baby, burn it down. I'm trying to save the world, fresh out of prison. You know what I'm saying? And so I changed, and I went to work at the community college in a entry level like administrative role. and administrative assistants learn about everything. Like, cause a fire administrative assistant be knowing everything going on at the company. And so next thing, I went and worked in the workforce development space. So I have worked in these different systems to where I knew what was going on. I knew what the disparities were. I knew, who wasn't reaching the market. So when we looked at funding strategies initially, it started with behavioral health. And so, people want to talk about opioids. When it was the war on drugs, it was a different story. But I know good and well that there's a lot of people that look like me that struggle with substance use, but they might not be engaging with treatment because of stigma. So when it was go time, and this is go nationwide go time, when you're ready to talk about your behavioral health programs, your programs that are addressing addiction, make sure you include, especially for the Black-led organizations, how you are going to leverage your trust to be able to bridge the gap to the resources like treatment, right? Inpatient treatment, outpatient treatment, medication for opioid use disorder. So that's one strategy that can be adopted by any community-based organization. And if your organization doesn't have the budget or the fiduciary capacity, then you can partner with the bigger organization to get the grant or the contract, right? The other part is with workforce development. Like I said, the BJA grant that we got is talk about workforce development. We all know, anybody with lived experience or anybody in the community know, you see who ain't getting the jobs. You see who ain't getting the certificates, the trades. And so your qualitative data is going to feed into your grant application to get the dollars in to give them some quantitative data. You know what I'm saying? And so that's the way we did it. And that can be replicated, baby, because we know who keep getting left behind. Like she said, there's nothing new under the sun. I can't tell you how many times I've seen Black people operating heavy equipment. Right. And so it's up to us to be able to see what's going on and what's missing in the community. And then we provide that type of program. Now, flexibility wise, I can understand why you said that. But with us, we'll go for, we got this substance use disorder contract. But in our application, I'm talking about formerly incarcerated people. I'm talking about reentry and those people who have been removed from using, who now have 50 times they're 50 times more likely to die from an opioid overdose than the people who are not coming out of incarceration. So now that we have a reentry program, then I educate them about how over 80% of the people who are incarcerated have substance use disorder. So now we have a substance use disorder program that's basically a reentry program. And now I can make sure I serve Black people, because Black people ain't wanting to go to inpatient treatment, but we are going to prison. And so if we can leverage that type of ideology, now we can get people coming out of prison and assess their needs and serve them, even if they wasn't listed on paper as somebody who had opioid use disorder.
I mean, dropping them, nuggets, dropping them. Appreciate it. So we are coming to the end of this, and I tell you, I think that we could go on and on. We could take this conversation another hour. For sure. We at the Moriah Group are exploring ways that we can keep this going. Again, this is the last sort of session in our series, but how do we keep this going? I think that was one of the questions in the Q&A is, what can our organization do to help you all tell your stories of your organizations and the work that you are doing. But I do want to circle back in sort of final comments, get everybody's final comment. But I want to make sure I include the folks that are near and dear to my heart, and that is young people. And I would say, my question, or in your final remarks, if you would share, as we think about the criminal legal system and truly moving to a just legal system, and all of the things that are out there that our young people are facing, and all of the interventions and the ways in which you all are connecting with our young folks, what would you say to keep our young people motivated right now? They are facing a lot. And I would just love to hear, what is that wisdom that you all have for young folks, and for the folks that are, tuned into this panel that work with young folks and that have programs supporting young folks. What would you say? And anybody can jump in.
One sentence. It's okay to not be okay. Mm.
I mean, I would advise them to go within, right? Search yourself, search internally, right? I think we are a people, regardless of your religious affiliation, who deal in spirit very much. And there's things that are untangible in terms of our people and how we are resilient through the course of human history, despite the many obstacles we face. We've been here before, but for whatever reason, we come out on top because there's something that is driving us, that is sitting at the core of our existence. And for anybody who is in despair or overwhelmed by the current thing, the way things are, it's a matter of, okay, instead of looking out and responding to life, go within so that you can reimagine the world that you want to exist in. Hip hop is amazing at this because it facilitates the opportunity for us to reimagine anything. And from that space, you can reimagine our justice system. You can reimagine our political system. But I think that takes a deep exploration of the self before we externalize that. So it's a matter of, yeah, absolutely going within.
Yeah, I would add on to what both of them said. And, you know, the one thing that I love about hip hop and what I love to tell young people is that we are at the beginning of our culture. We're literally at the beginning of our culture. So the future really belongs to them. I let them know that we love them, we believe in them, and we need them. You know, and like this document behind me is the Hip Hop Declaration of Peace. That's a document that we presented to the United Nations May 16, 2001. So next year at the 25th anniversary, a number of young people that have never known about that document, but I tell them, when you learn that document and it talks about hip hop beyond entertainment, as I tell people all the time, you know, for 30 years we've been literally running around saying rap is something we do, hip hop is something we live. You know, from a KRS-One quote back in '93, and we have to have um, principles over the personalities because that's, you know, kind of get caught up in a lot of the personalities that we don't hold ourselves accountable to principles. We have to teach them that their culture is more valuable than the corporations. And we have to teach them that as people, they are more valuable than whatever profits those corporations will make off of them. So, you know, I treat young people the same way I treat my own children and grandchildren, with love and with respect, and let them, hopefully they can see what I see in them, even if they can't catch the vision at the age that they are. You know, I read somewhere where there's no vision, that's where the people perish. Well, we have a vision of 18 principles. It's an international culture. And that's what I tell the young people. This is a future that you can create for yourself internationally.
Um, and,
Word.
and my wrap up, I would say that I would just continue to push the importance of us organizing and building power together because that's what it's going to take. We've all had a lot of, shared experiences, whether we say it or not. We can probably go down our whole life experience, and we have a lot of shared experiences. And those are things that we need to share with the youth. But then also we need to lean into the text that says, despise not thy youth. And as we lean into that understanding that our youth are also leaders as well. And so let's ensure that we are creating space and succession plans so that our youth are we're able to give them work that we're not ashamed of as we transition and pass the baton, but also let the baton go so that they can lead. So that would be my wrap up.
That was good. I am just thrilled to have had the opportunity to moderate this panel with you all today. As Reverend Phillips said, I have learned. I have notes that I have jotted down. Y'all have dropped some gems, some diamonds for sure. And I know that the folks that tuned in had the opportunity have also that same perspective. And so I really appreciate your experience, your knowledge, your vulnerability, your honesty, your sharing, your willingness to share. And we will